Hey friends, I hope everyone is doing well and having a good week. Hope school's going well. You don't have that much longer, so hang in there. This week we have another one-week series, and it is on the topic of arguing. So really, no matter who you are, where you live, what kind of personality you have, we've all experienced what it feels like to struggle with arguing at some point. And I know for me, when I was a teenager, there was definitely some times that I would get into small arguments with my dad. I always hated getting into like any sort of trouble or arguing though. Like, him being disappointed in me was the worst feeling in the world. I think we pretty much all feel the same way about arguing with people that we love and care about. It's not really fun or something we enjoy doing, but everyone kind of has a go-to style for arguing. And in the same way, we all have something that we will fight for, that we're ready to fight for, that we'll kind of like throw down for. Our worlds are full of arguments, and the options are endless. So when the world around you is in conflict, most people tend to do one of three things. So that is go straight to anger, feel torn, or couldn't care less. When we really get involved in an argument, we all just want to do one thing, and that's to win. And most of us have a few tactics that we have developed to help us win those arguments. So it could be the silent treatment, it could be yelling and screaming, it could be ghosting someone, it could be, talking to that person, or it could be talking about them. Whether in our homes or on social media or in the culture around us, we're surrounded by big questions with big arguments, so like for and against nearly everything. So with that in mind, especially now in a time with unavoidable arguments, what do we do? How can we get better at arguing? All right, we are looking in the passage of James. In our last one-week series on words, we were also in James, and we talked about how James was the brother of Jesus. So what's interesting about James is that more than likely he didn't grow up thinking about Jesus being the Son of God. He more grew up thinking about Jesus just being his older brother, which is pretty wild. Now, when Jesus left home and started teaching in the Judean countryside and traveling around with messages about what God was like, we see what James did, and that was that he stayed away. So we can probably assume that the way James responded that way was because they were siblings and they probably had some conflict, just like other siblings. So it is interesting to read what James wrote about conflict, tension, and convincing others that you're right. And that's what we're going to look at in James 1:19. My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. Now, James began to see something he didn't see before. Jesus, his brother, wasn't acting like God. He was God in a body. When James changed his mind about Jesus and saw him for who he really was, it changed his perspective. It put everything else in perspective, including conflict. And so in this verse, in verse 19, James first tells us to listen first. So that means hearing things from the other person's perspective and actually listening with intent to learn from that person instead of trying just to change their mind. And that's so important because sometimes we listen, but we're not really listening. We're just thinking about how we're gonna respond after they're done talking. So really listening with that intent of learning from someone is so important. And so next, James says that we should be slow to speak and slow to become angry. And this is important because it does not mean we shouldn't speak at all. It doesn't mean we should just like sit back and take whatever someone throws at us, but it does mean that we don't speak reactively. So we're pausing, we're taking a deep breath, we're composing our thoughts and emotions before speaking. So we're not just throwing back reactively. I think we all know what it is like to be quick to speak and quick to become angry, and often the people we're fighting with are people we really care about, and they are going to matter far longer than the thing we're even arguing about. And I know for me personally, I think about times that I've had arguments with friends in the past, and thinking about how much I value those relationships, and now I don't even remember what those arguments were about. So it's so important to remember. And you never win an argument if you lose the relationship. Like that's not really winning. So maybe instead of asking how do I win the argument, the question we should be asking is how do I win the relationship? I will be the first to admit that learning and figuring out how to handle arguments and conflict and disagreement is probably one of the hardest parts of being a mature human being, because we are imperfect and we do want to go back to that state of just wanting to win the argument. So it's not easy, but we do have some application for you, so we can start working on remembering to win the relationship and not the argument. So the first thing is memorizing scripture, and the scripture we just talked about, James 1 verses 19, is such a great reminder of be quick to listen and then slow to speak and slow to anger. And just like song lyrics, we can get that in our head and kind of shift our focus whenever we're struggling with that. The second thing is pause and pray. And this is so important because first it gives us that second of pause where we can take a deep breath before we respond reactively. But also when we're praying for someone, it really shifts our perspective about that person. It helps us remember that they are also human. And so that brings us to our third point, which is empathize. And so whenever we have empathy, it helps us to actually put ourselves in the other person's shoe and think about what is it that they want out of this as well. And then from there, you can usually still talk about whatever the discussion is from their point of view, and you can empathize even if you still disagree, which is so important, because that doesn't mean we have to agree with everything, but we can still empathize with that person, and remembering to listen with intent of learning from that person. All right, we may not be able to change the way people behave when it comes to conflict, arguing, and disagreement, but what is so important to remember is that we can change the way we behave in those situations. So as you head out this week, try to work on those 3 tips. Go ahead and start memorizing that scripture, and remember to be quick to listen first, and then slow to anger and slow to speak. And I think we'll really start to see a change in ourselves, and then see how we